Long before the first ships from Europe reached the distant shores of tropical Africa, a powerful and peaceful network of trade already existed. It was a vast commercial system whose markets and links by land and sea stretched as far as India and China. Its African heart lay far from the coast, here in the great medieval empire of Mali. Today, Mali is among the poorest countries in the world. But 600 years ago, it was a land of wealth and comfort. This is Jenne, still a flourishing market town, but once a commercial center of far-ranging importance. Jenne guaranteed the prosperity of a great regional system, attracting camel caravans which brought merchandise from all points of the compass. The reason is explained in a single word. This was an economy based on gold. And that gold is much in evidence even today. The fascinating story of the Caravans of Gold may be unknown or quite forgotten in the outside world. But here in Jenne, it's a story that remains vividly alive. Even a little side street of this ancient city, once part of the great empire of Mali, can afford a glimpse of rich traditions from the past. The fine jewelry of his craft still reflects the brilliance of the golden trade of old West Africa. The smith usually works from quantities of gold dust, melted in a crucible, and then fashioned by skillful beating into shapes long hallowed by tradition. The design of these earrings may reflect the art of the individual craftsman, but it never strays too far from the recognized styles preferred by the different peoples of the region, Bambara, Mandinka, Soninke, and others. Each of these peoples has its own distinctive jewelry. The size, rather than the style, gives an indication of a person's standing. Here, gold has always been used as much for display as for a standard of wealth. By about AD 1250, the oldest goldfields along the upper reaches of the Niger River to the west of Jenne were becoming exhausted. But to the great advantage of trading towns like Jenne, a new source of gold began to be developed. Rich quantities of gold now came from the country to the south, today part of the modern Republic of Ghana. This development brought power and wealth to the forest people, and in due course to those of the kingdom of Ashanti. Even today, King Apoku-Ware, traditional ruler of Ashanti, can still display the glittering opulence which so astonished the first Europeans who visited this kingdom, founded 3 centuries ago. The Ashanti use of gold is lavish and extraordinary, and it reflects the golden wealth of the grand empires of Western Africa in the Middle Ages. 200 years ago, a North African historian described the royal court and ceremonial of that distant time in the empire of ancient Ghana, almost as though he were describing King Opokuwari of today.
The king adorns himself like a woman, wearing necklaces and bracelets of gold. Behind him stand pages holding shields and swords decorated with gold, and on his right are the sons of the subordinate kings of his country, all wearing splendid garments and their hair plaited with gold.
Today, most of the king's political power has gone. But in accordance with tradition, the king still has the right to promote his subordinate chiefs to higher ranks. These chiefs, as on similar occasions in the past, come forward one by one to reaffirm their loyalty and offer royal praises. Ashanti power rested on farming prosperity and military strength, but its gold had long attained a far wider influence. By a fortunate blessing, the majestic Niger, called by its people the River of Singers, lay to the north. A learned Egyptian visitor of the 14th century described this great trading region as 4 months of travel long and 4 months wide. The Mali Empire was, in fact, among the biggest trading systems in the world, with its roots in the gold of Western Africa. From the markets of the Upper Niger to those of Hausaland and Bornu, a distance wider than Western Europe, the Niger still carries a daily traffic whose style and tones speak for an ancient stability and peace. Gold here was always important, but nobody can eat gold. The Niger has always provided fish in abundant quantities, and that's a vital source of protein in a local diet based largely on cereals. With no means of refrigeration in this hot climate, immediate drying or smoking of the fish has been essential, if they're to be kept for any length of time. By custom, this work is done by women, who usually share the profit on a family basis. Smoke-dried fish is carried and sold to towns and villages far from the river itself. A day's journey from Jenne, downstream along this broad river highway, traders reach Mopti, nowadays the biggest market along this section of the Niger. I've come to this port on the great inland waterway of West Africa, the River Niger, more than 1,000 miles from the sea, because it's always been a vital artery of trade. And in this port and others like it, the wealth of this vast inland region arrived and departed fashionable cottons from Hausaland, tusks of ivory from grassland hunters, cola nuts from the forests of the south, foods in bulk such as sorghum, bars of iron, bars of copper, and most precious of all, the biggest underlying standard of trading value, gold. The women wear their immensely valuable regalia in perfect safety. It seems that this sense of security is by no means new. A famous traveller of the 14th century visited the Empire of Mali when it was still at the height of its prosperity and recorded this in his memoirs.
Of all peoples, the Negroes are those who most abhor injustice. There is complete and general safety throughout the land. The traveller here has no more reason than the man who stays at home to fear brigands, thieves, or ravishers.
The man who wrote those words was a travelling scholar from Morocco named Ibn Battuta. And fortunately for us, his memoirs have survived, recalling much of the vivid detail of West Africa as it was 600 years ago. Here is his description of Mali's imperial court.
On certain days, the Sultan holds audiences in the palace yard, where there is a platform under a tree. It is carpeted with silk, and over it stands an umbrella which serves as a kind of silken pavilion surmounted by a bird in gold. On his head the Sultan wears a golden skullcap. His usual dress is a velvety red tunic made out of costly European fabrics. The Sultan is preceded by musicians who carry gold and silver guitars, and behind him come 300 armed slaves.
The wide prosperity of the West African interior called for a unifying form of government, and that was provided through almost 1,000 years by the old empires, ancient Ghana, then Mali, and then Songhai and Bornu. These old empires ensured a widely accepted stability and peace. Word about the wealth of these lands got out in time even to distant Europe. A famous Spanish map of 1375 portrayed the source and controller of that wealth. While the outline of North Africa was already known, the map gave Europe for the first time pictorial news of the far interior. Beneath the desert wastes of the Sahara, in the middle of the Empire of Mali, the map showed the figure of a Berber camel rider, who might almost be Ibn Battuta himself. He's shown approaching the mighty lord of Mali, seated on his throne and holding aloft a splendid orb of gold. This emperor was rumored to be the wealthiest man on the face of the earth. In 1324, an earlier emperor of Mali, Kankan Musa, was returning from a pilgrimage to Mecca. Eager to enhance the prestige of Islam, he decided to convert his trading city of Timbuktu into a center of learning and religion. At the heart of this Islamic city, Emperor Musa built a mosque that set a new style in West African architecture. It was the beginning of Timbuktu's wide and well-deserved reputation as a focus of African scholarship, teaching Islamic law and politics as well as theology. Writing soon after 1500, a visitor from Spain set down his impressions.
In Timbuktu, there are numerous judges and learned men, all well supported by the ruler of the city. Many handwritten books from North Africa are sold here, and there is more profit to be had from this book trade than from any other branch of commerce.
Based on the written word, the teachings of Islam brought to these lands a new literacy, still very much alive today. Like Muslim children everywhere, these youngsters have to learn the Quran by heart. But they must do it in Arabic, a language that's not their own. It was and is a stern training, an old-fashioned discipline, not intended to be fun. Islam exercised a profound and permanent effect on West African life. Through the influence of Islamic scholars, this great region became an intellectual part of a wide world across many frontiers. At heart, the teachings of the Prophet were a code of strict moral behavior, a set of rules to help men govern their personal, inner lives. But Islam also had its public face. Rules were established for credit and pricing, all of which led to more efficient ways of organizing trade. There's not much business here any longer, but Timbuktu, after about 1300 AD, became and remained a market town of widespread fame. To this northernmost point on the River Niger, goods came up from Jenne, and here merchants and dealers from every neighboring country got together with the Berber traders who made the voyage across the great desert. For me, this is one of Africa's truly dramatic scenes, just because it shows a crucial link in Africa's historical development. Even now, on certain days, you can walk out from Timbuktu and glimpse the inner drama of trans-Saharan trade. On this day, these Tuareg Berbers who operate the camel caravans are bringing a load of salt southwards from the surface mines at Taoudeni, 500 miles to the north, a journey of 21 days each way. And on their journey northward, in the heyday of the old prosperity, they also carried gold. The arrival of the caravan will be greeted with music and dancing. Against the background of their harsh environment, the Tuareg travelers of the desert have created a musical culture full of elegance. The caravan's arrival is an occasion for these Tuareg people to celebrate their skill in mastering the relentless trails of the Sahara. And there's joy and relief at having reached another journey's end. Here I'm some way out beyond the edge of the southern shore of this vast ocean of sand, the Sahara Desert. And these are the people of the desert, the Tuareg, a hard people who live in a hard land, not a bit romantic in spite of appearances. Today's descendants of the Berber nomads, who in ancient times mastered the secrets of human survival in the desert and made themselves at home here. Immensely self-reliant, persevering, they became the lords of the long-distance caravan trade long before the camel was known in these regions, and that was 2,000 years ago. I like to think of the crucial part played by these voyagers, always facing the perils of the desert, traveling through weeks and months, navigating by guess or by intuition, or else navigating by the stars. "60 days of riding and walking were needed to cross the Sahara, a daily average of about 25 miles between the ports of the opposing shores. Several main routes led from oasis to oasis. Some went through the western Sahara, others crossed further east, but the eventual destination was Cairo. Almost a generation ago, this film was made of a typical caravan as it came out of the desert through the Atlas Mountains to arrive at Marrakesh, famous among the ports or cities on the northern fringe of the Sahara. In these Berber towns throughout the Middle Ages, the gold of West Africa set the monetary standard for long-distance commerce and provided the substance of their riches. It's the end of Ramadan, a time for celebration. Frequently on the move, these people of the tent, as they like to call themselves, have always controlled the trading routes through North Africa. And long ago, their power and influence were greater still, for their kings and governments ruled a brilliant Islamic civilization in Spain for several hundred years. But mostly the Berbers were given to the pleasures of small wars amongst themselves, of which they never seemed to tire. While Berber clans could unite with each other against an external enemy, strong local loyalties and rivalries usually divided them. The power they once wielded can still be caught on ceremonial days like this, when all their fiery pride is on display. Throughout the Middle Ages, fierce and fast-moving Berber warriors of various clans monopolized all movement of goods across the Sahara. Without them, the intricate trading networks of northern Africa would have withered in the sun. These men were the lords of the desert, and their influence reached from Timbuktu to the proud gates of Cairo. This is the gate of Old Cairo, opening to the south and west, the Bab el-Zawela, a superb structure built 900 years ago. Through its majestic portals, century after century, came traders and travelers, generals, even kings from West Africa, North Africa, from Muslim Spain, and sometimes from the countries of Christian Europe. The whole international system of trade of those days, reaching as it did from the Atlantic to the Sea of China, had its heart and center here in Old Cairo. City of Islam since the 7th century, Cairo entered a long period of prosperity and power when the sultans of northwest Africa, known as the Fatimid dynasty, moved east from Tunis and established here a new capital. Under the Fatimid sultans, Cairo became a remarkably rich and tolerant city, renowned for its spending on art and scholarship, and dominating the commerce of half the world. Ibn Khaldun, a great North African historian, has left us a description of the city he knew as it was at the end of the 14th century.
Cairo is the metropolis of the universe, the garden of the world, the gateway of Islam, the throne of kings. A city of castles and palaces, lit by the moons and stars of erudition.
And all this grand structure of learning and devotion was underpinned and its credit upheld by a monetary standard of coins minted in African gold. For years, the most important coin remained the Almoravid or Berber dinar of northwest Africa. Then Europe, emerging from its poverty in the Dark Ages, became at last able to pay for the import of African gold. Florence minted the first European gold coins since Roman times. Other cities followed, and new gold currencies appeared in Spain and the Netherlands, France and Portugal. A new era in commercial development had begun, laying foundations for Europe's supremacy in trade and industry. The new monetary standard moved north as far as England, where a series of gold coins were to culminate in the famous Golden Guinea of Charles II, minted like all the others in gold from West Africa, symbolized by an elephant. Europe depended on Africa for its monetary stability in a trading partnership which we can see reflected in the grand flowering of Renaissance culture. However different they might be in their history and appearance, black people are depicted in these great works of art as the natural equals of white people. This had been the attitude of the Greeks and Romans, and still, for a time at least, it remained the attitude of Europe. In that ever-surprising new dawn of the Renaissance, the essential unity of mankind was not in question. But African trading links reached far beyond Europe. To the east of Cairo lay the great sea routes to India and China. The sailing rig in use today has changed very little since the great trading days of the past. East African sailors were tacking their ships against the wind up to an angle of 35 degrees long before Europeans had learned the necessary technique. The Africans who manned and still man these vessels are the Swahili, a coastal people who speak their own African language. These mariners were at home on the highways of the sea, just as in West Africa the camel caravans traversed the Saharan ocean of sand. So did the ships of the Swahili traverse their ocean of water. Once again, this time in the east, linking the African interior with the markets of the world. This is Lamu, a charming little town on the northern coast of Kenya. It was the destination of many of the ships coming down from the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and some from as far away as India and even China. They timed their voyages to take advantage of the seasonal monsoon winds which blow back and forth between the Swahili coast and northern India. The ships brought with them not only goods for sale, but a wide range of ideas and beliefs. The most influential of these came from the lands of Islam to the north. And it was not long before the majority of Swahili had accepted Islam. In spite of this northern influence, much of their culture has remained distinctly and uniquely Swahili, and it has kept its own identity. This traditional stick dance is a kind of ballet, but it's also an occasion for individual challenge. And that's very much an element in the culture and character of the Swahili. Although the cities of the Swahili in their heyday had a common interest in trade, each of them preferred to stay on its own. They liked to compete against each other, as these men in this stick dance, but had no interest in territorial conquest. Lamu was just one of many Swahili towns, built in coral stone all the way along the coast from Somalia down to Mozambique. The domestic architecture of Lamu has been no mere copy of the styles of Arabia or India. From the outside of a traditional Swahili house, there's really nothing to see except a blank wall and a porch with benches for receiving guests. And even when the handsome front doors are opened, there's still only a blank wall behind them. But once inside, it's a very different story. 600 or 700 years ago, when houses like this one first began to be designed and built by Swahili architects for leading men and merchants, there were few houses anywhere else in the world so well designed for comfortable city life. This particular house dates from the early 18th century, but much older examples of Swahili domestic architecture not only demonstrated a unique construction and embellishment, but were built to a high standard of what we now call modern conveniences. While the inhabitants of London in Elizabethan times were emptying chamber pots out of the window, Swahili residents of Lamu who could afford such a house as this enjoyed the luxury of good internal sanitation. These old Swahili houses spell out for us the basic aims that guided the architects in their design: to make the best possible use of local materials, finely plastered coral stone, necessarily short rafters of mangrove tree poles, and then to ensure a high level of domestic privacy, and not least to show off and guarantee the creditworthiness of the owner, so essential in a community whose livelihood always depended on the profits and the risks of long-distance trade. Lamu is nowadays the best preserved of the old Swahili coastal towns, but it was by no means the most important. Through excavation or analysis of graveyards such as this one, archaeologists have identified more than 50 Swahili towns, all constructed in the same coral stone, a stone which can be readily worked beneath the surface of the ocean, but then takes on a permanent toughness and durability soon after being exposed to the air and sun. And here is one of the best surviving examples of the pillar graves unique to this Swahili coast. And there are, as you see, fine pieces of porcelain from China embedded in this African tomb. Such plates and bowls from ancient China are pointers to the involvement of Africa in the far-reaching networks of Eastern trade long before the coming of the Europeans. Even more striking evidence is provided by this Chinese painting of an African giraffe, dating from the year 1414. The giraffe was sent as a gift to the Chinese emperor from one of the cities of the Swahili. Looking rather indignant, it must have endured a voyage of many months. The Swahili cities were built at short distances from each other all down the long East African coastline. The southernmost of them was the chief point which linked the Indian Ocean traders with the gold-producing region of the southern African interior. On this high and fertile plateau, a flourishing civilization had developed, which, like the kingdoms of West Africa, played a decisive role in the trading patterns of the Middle Ages. And here on these temperate grasslands, a unique culture, emerging in about the 12th century, reached its climax in the splendid buildings which are known today as Great Zimbabwe. Efforts to recapture the essence of Great Zimbabwe culture were undermined a century ago by treasure-seeking Europeans. They came up from South Africa and ransacked this place for gold and jewelry soon after they discovered it. A few pieces escaped the looters, all made from local gold, mined extensively in the area from about the year 800. But perhaps even more surprising are some of the objects found here for which Zimbabwe gold was traded. Delicate ornaments brought across the ocean from China and India. It's evidence like this which has helped historians and archaeologists to piece together the whole great story of long-distance trade. That trade had its source in the Zimbabwe cultures of Inner Africa, which possessed the skills as well as the wealth to build powerful monuments. On these massive walls, overlooking the entire area, stood sacred bird carvings in stone. They were associated with oracles that were thought to speak for the gods. The religious heart of Great Zimbabwe stood on a hilltop commanding the surrounding countryside. In the valley below, the king had his royal residence. All this activity called for a strong central government, and that government was formed by their king and council, who ruled from here through lesser kings and governors in a wide territory across the vast central plateau of southern Africa. Even now, these mighty walls make an irresistible claim to political power and achievement. 17 feet thick in places and 800 feet in length, they're as big and impressive as a great cathedral. Far too impressive, as it turned out, for the white settlers of later years. They refused to believe that this could have been the work of Africans, or that these very Africans had a trading network which stretched right across the known world. And far down the East African coast, on this most distant link in the old trading network, there lies hidden the last of its surprises. On a long voyage southward, the traders pursued their route far beyond Zanzibar. There they approached what was once the most important and famous of all the Swahili trading cities. This was Kilwa, on an island close by the coast of modern Tanzania. It's hard to get here, for Kilwa remains quite untouched by the modern world. This is still the only means of approach to one of the most intriguing historical sites in the whole of Africa. Surprising as it must seem, up these steps some 600 years ago came visitors from all the countries of the Golden East, ambassadors, merchants, soldiers, mariners. And what they saw spread out before them as they reached the top was a scene, a sight of remarkable and even unique splendor. But ruin struck long ago. Rising to great commercial wealth in about the year 1200, Kilwa was once a place of comfort and urban splendor. Its royal palace, one of the grand buildings of Islamic and Swahili culture, as portrayed in this accurate archaeological reconstruction. Here was one of the high points of civilized development promoted and sustained by Africa's trading networks. Placed on the edge of the ocean skyline, Kilwa was much admired by our old traveling companion, Ibn Battuta. He came here in 1332 and remembered Kilwa as one of the most handsome towns he'd seen in all his travels. This once splendid mosque remains, even in partial ruin, a most impressive religious monument. Here on the distant fringe of the world of Islam, the African citizens of Kilwa honored their membership of that world with a taste and craftsmanship distinctively their own. Founded in the 12th century, the mosque was much enlarged in the 15th, when a patriotic citizen spent 1,000 gold dinars on improvements. Very soon after, in the year 1498, an event took place which was to lead not only to the ruin of Kilwa, but in due course to the destruction of the Swahili trading network all along the coast. In that year, for the first time in history, 3 small Portuguese ships under the command of Vasco da Gama sailed round the Cape of Good Hope and into the Indian Ocean. The European incursion had begun. Returning home, Vasco da Gama reported what he'd seen. And just 7 years later, a much larger and more menacing fleet appeared on the horizon. A German eyewitness called Hans Meyer has left an account of what took place.
Admiral d'Almeida came here with 14 men of war and 6 caravels. He ordered the ships to have their artillery ready. At dawn on Thursday, the 24th of July, all went into their boats to the shore. They went straight to the palace, and only those inhabitants who did not resist were granted their lives. At the palace, the Holy Cross was put down, and Admiral d'Almeida prayed. Then, everyone started to plunder the town of all its merchandise and provisions.
The sack of Kilwa by the Portuguese in 1505 marked a turning point in the history of the whole East African coast. For the Portuguese, and after them the Dutch, the English, the French, seized the Indian Ocean trade and turned it to their own benefit. The old Swahili cities of coral stone, which had depended on that trade and now lost it, fell into decay. Indeed, Africa had now to suffer a long period of destructive conflict and confrontation begun by the outside world, and this would continue until these old splendors of the African past were all but forgotten. An African king, the Emir of Katsina in northern Nigeria, rides out from his palace for the annual parade and festival called the Salah at the end of the Muslim fast of Ramadan. The idea of kingship as a means of tackling the problems of government is as old and established in Africa as in any other continent. Surrounded by his bodyguards and by troops of loyal followers, the king receives the allegiance of his people. The king no longer has any real political power, but he is the traditional ruler of an ancient city and kingdom of the Hausa, one of many African peoples who built their own organized states over the past 1,000 years. Kings need to display their wealth, and if they're wise, they also provide entertainment. But above all, kings need to display their power and authority in ways that are clear to everyone. The Salah is also a political event. Even today, this is more than a mere display. It's an act of recognition. The king is accompanied by royal guards in the finery of an ancient military tradition. Some have equipment and body armor that seem to go back to long-lost Christian Nubia, and even to the time of the Crusades. All now await the ritual act of allegiance by the lesser chiefs of Katsina, the Jafi. wave upon wave, in a gesture which is part threatening and part submissive, the district heads salute their master. Of course, there is a great deal more in history than the drama of kings and queens. A lot of African peoples found it easy, and indeed better, to do without royal masters. Yet kingship clearly remained an important part of the story, and the facts of Africa's historical development reveal a wide variety of kingdoms and empires. Most of the old kingdoms have vanished long since, and all the old empires, but some of them have left behind, for us, magnificent reminders of their majesty and power. This astonishing sculpture in gleaming copper represents one of the rulers, or Oni, of the Kingdom of Ife in western Nigeria 7 or 8 centuries ago. And yet, when these superb sculptures first came to the attention of Europeans, only as recently as 1910, the experts at once pronounced that Africans could never have conceived or made them, and that some wandering European must have been the artist. Now the world knows better. The truth is that these are portraits of African kings made by African artists for use in royal ceremonial. South from Ife and near the coast, there flourished the ancient city and empire of Benin. This old print, following a Dutchman's visit in about 1620, shows the king of Benin riding out to receive the plaudits of his people. Benin artists, beginning at least as early as 1400, had long been developing their own styles and techniques, styles that were entirely African in inspiration and execution. They have their place today among the artistic masterpieces of the world. This ivory armlet places the king where he belonged in Benin society, at the center of all things. Plaques in brass, which once adorned the walls of the Orba's palace, reinforce the power and mystery of the king. A visitor from Holland to the King of Benin in about 1600 wrote this report.
The city is composed of 30 main streets, very straight and wide. The houses are arranged in good order. The people are in no way inferior to the Dutch in cleanliness. Their houses are as polished as a looking glass. They have good laws and efficient police and show us 1,000 marks of friendship.
The Orba, king of men, could handle leopards, the kings of the forest, like toys. From his waist sprang mudfish, symbols of power over sea and river, whose guardian was Olakan, archangel of the waters. The king had great authority, but this depended on the support of noblemen and appointed chiefs, and on certain persons of ritual power. Among these were the Queen Mothers of Benin, one of whom is shown in this memorable head, sculpted in about 1550. Adjoining Benin was the ancient empire of the Yoruba people, with its heart in the city of Oyo. The Yoruba developed great military strength based on cavalry. In matters of state, the king of Oyo had to consult his council, the Oyo Mesi. If the council were united against him, the king was in trouble. In theory, he was supreme, whether in religious affairs or secular matters. But if he lost the confidence of the Oyo Mesi, he could even face death. Such was the authority of the council that if they turned against him, the king might have to commit suicide. So kingly power in old Africa was a two-edged sword, and rulers had to use it with care. When at last Europeans reached these shores, they came at first in peace, as traders or ambassadors, asking favors. The king could grant trading permits, which he did in return for handsome gifts. Great deference was shown by these European visitors, and many accounts speak with admiration of the splendor of African kings, their courts, and their palaces. The cities, too, were large and impressive enough to command European respect. This was certainly true of the Hausa city of Kano, painted here by the German traveler Heinrich Barth during a visit in 1851. The Hausa people lived in a cluster of independent states north of the junction of the Niger and Benue rivers. Each state had its own capital, like Katsina or Kano. Kano today is one of the major cities of modern Nigeria, and like most of our world has lost some of its reverence for kingly power, smothered beneath the motor cars and the main roads. But Kano still has some vestiges of its ancient dignity, including parts of the old city wall. Restored and preserved behind metal barricades, some of the old gates still pierce these crumbling ramparts first built in the reign of King Tsariki during the 12th century. Modern Kano is as brash and noisy as any African city of our time, with its concrete office blocks, its traffic jams, its utterly persistent roadside vendors, and imperious police force. Although the principal mosque is modern, it's still possible to find traditional houses, side by side with the new. These old townhouses were designed to match the hot, dry climate of the Western Sudan, and Kano's trading visitors often feel at home with older ways of life. Like so much else in Nigeria today, this modern city of Kano has grown out of an ancient civilization and from a local enterprise practiced through a long period of early development. Kano's story through the centuries became one of singular drama and brilliance. Ever since the Middle Ages, this old city has been a magnet for countless travelers, a place of rest after hard journeys, a seat of scholarship and of royal power, and a market echoing with the din and traffic of the whole Western Sudan. Trade has been a major activity in Kano since early times and has grown in importance with the city itself. Some of these goods have been traded for hundreds of years, such as rock salt from the Sahara, and pepper and spices from the south. And from about 1500 onwards, a new commodity, brought from the forest lands and much prized as a stimulant, cola nuts. Whether the trade was long distance or local, Kano was, as it is today, a place where there was money to be made and goods manufactured for sale. The reasons for Kano's prosperity go back to the origins of the city. This small hill, so barren and so empty, contains within its past another of the surprises of African history. To reach its secret, we have to go back more than 1,000 years. At that time, before or about AD 900, people came and settled and began to build a little town here on this hill, which they called Dala. To begin with, Dala was just another hill settlement, a source of iron ore and a place of refuge, otherwise no more important than many other small villages scattered across Hausaland. The early history of the region tells of rivalry between these villages, and Kano, well placed to take advantage of the natural wealth of the region, gradually emerged as the most powerful settlement in its area. According to the Kano Chronicle, an ancient record of remembered history, the early kings then set about extending their rule. One by one, they outmaneuvered their rivals and absorbed their lands, much like the warring barons of feudal Europe. The royal palace, Gedan Runfa, was built in the 15th century, but the ritual pomp and circumstance of the court dates from much earlier times. Preceded by women praise singers who tell the world of his power and glory, the King of Kano emerges from the inner palace for his daily round of public duties. For centuries, the court has been run by a small army of officials, some born in service, others descended from noble families. In the old days, these officials ensured that limits were placed on the power of the king.
He had his council, consisting of 4 traditional kingmakers. These were the Madaki of Kano, the Makama of Kano, the Sarkinda Kimetuta of Kano, and the Sarkimbai of Kano, which of course is myself. And they used to give advice to the emir on all matters.
The person of the king himself was shrouded in mystery. Even the simple action of sitting down on his throne had to be concealed from public gaze. Only then could lesser chiefs draw near to pay elaborate homage. The king's face and most of the rest of his person were obscured from public view. His royal feet were not supposed to touch the ground. The ostrich feather sandals were part of his exclusive regalia. But in spite of all this prestige, there were strict limits to the king's authority. The 4 kingmakers had the power to choose the heir to the throne from any one of the male children of the royal family. The king was dependent on the cooperation of a large hierarchy of lesser chiefs. This was a kind of constitutional monarchy. The power of the nobles was checked by the authority of slave officials appointed by the king. These were not slaves in the modern sense, but much more like the royal retainers of European monarchs. Kano even had its own jester, licensed to tell awkward truths when others preferred tactful silence. But there were other royal servants with great authority. A leading nobleman of Kano, the Makaman.
Well, slave officials, there were two. That is Shamakin Kano, Salama, Darini, and Kilishi, slaves.
Although men of noble birth might still call them slaves, these royal servants, just like the king's men of European monarchs, could wield decisive influence. One of the most powerful of them was an official still known as the Shamaki.
Gidan kansa a gidan hannunsa yake, da magudancin da yake Shamaki da wanda ke kofar gidan Shamaki. Duk a hannun Shamaki suke, babu ruwansu da sarki, sarki ba ruwansu da shi. Ɗaya in sarki zai nema sai ce a faɗa Shamaki, wani ai mar kaza kaza.
The Shamaki was responsible for the royal stables. Today there are only a few horses, but cavalry were once vital to the security of the state. The cavalry were the armoured divisions of their time. Even today the royal horses are valued so highly that they're fed every morning by hand. The Shamaki's position was one of crucial trust because whoever controlled the cavalry controlled the kingdom. But he himself owed his position directly to the king's patronage. Only a foolish official would bite the hand that feeds him. Another so-called slave official was the Salama. The Salama had responsibility for the royal arsenal, and he had direct access to the king.
Wanda sarki amincewa, wato abu ne amincewa ne ga sarki don za a je ya same shi a cikin gidansa. Kowane lokaci na da izinin da zai shiga ya samu sarki a gida. Aikin sallama da wannan amanar da na gaya maka ta gidansa, da amanar abin gaba kamar su bindiga, su kibiya, su lufudda, to duk ikon salama ne.
Guns were rare in Old Kano, and the king did his best to monopolize them for his royal bodyguard of musketeers. These were housed in the palace itself. Gunpowder is still manufactured in the palace arsenal, but it's only issued today for festivals and celebrations. Control of the bodyguard is vested in the Salama. This parade may be a bit of a joke, but the power once exercised by these appointed officials was real enough. Their task was to safeguard the security of the state. Early Kano had its own religion. Its beliefs involved ancestors, local spirits, and various natural forces. Many of these beliefs centered on a cult which endures to this day, known as Bori. The Bori ritual is extremely old. This form of it, nowadays little more than a popular entertainment, still carries an echo of its old magical persuasion. Over the centuries, as Kano's links with the outside world increased, the spirit cults gradually declined. They gave way to the modernizing influence of a world religion, Islam. Islam came here 1,000 years ago, but its real impact began with the arrival of Muslim traders from Mali around the year 1300. These were the Wangarawa, whose learning and prosperity reinforced the teachings of the Quran. Slowly, Muslim influence widened, until the great majority of the Kano people, led by their king, answered the call of the Prophet. By the middle of the 15th century, the power and wealth of Kano had grown to a point at which a new and enterprising ruler needed to develop more modern forms of government. Mohammed Runfa, one of the most famous kings of the old Harbi dynasty, sent for a North African expert in Muslim law and custom named Al-Maghili. Al-Haji Maita Masuli explains.
Sheikh Maghili, after having studied and after having become very learned and world famous in Islamic studies, decided to come to this part of the country to establish himself, which he did in Kano. He came during the reign of Muhammad Rumfa, a very well-known, very famous, and very scholarly emir of Kano during the Harbi days.
Al-Maghili advised the king to set an example to his people in religious matters, since religion and authority went together. The king enforced the Sharia, the Muslim legal code, and formed a panel of Islamic judges, the Qadis, to preside over the courts. The present Chief Qadi of Kano, Dr. Hassan Gwazo, is an expert on Al-Maghili's teachings.
In fact, he devised two types of courts, that is, courts of first instance and also court of appeal. The court of first instance were the courts to be manned by the Qadis, but the court of appeal was that of the emir himself, that is the emir in council, that is, people aggrieved by the decisions of the Qadis or by the attitude of any official of the emir, have got a right to go direct to the emir himself.
In a book called The Obligations of Princes, Al-Maghili set down a number of rules for the king to follow in the affairs of state.
He warned the ruler that he shouldn't content himself with informations brought to him by his officials, because he said, because sometimes complaints might be against the officials, and therefore the emir should be always accessible, and that is why we see in the history of kingship in Kano, from those days to this present time, that the emir has the practice of coming out, always sitting in a place where everybody can see him, and you can see that this is even done even today.
But if justice was in theory available to everyone, it was also sharply administered. The king and his council had the same power of life and death as their contemporaries in Europe.
He had the power to say if somebody had killed somebody, or the emir, and together with his legal advisors, would go through the case. And then if that person was absolutely guilty, the emir would send him to the hanging place. He had his head cut off.
The authority of the king was very great, but like other African kings of that time, including those of Benin and Oyo, he could not be a despot. He administered the law, but he also had to obey it. He ruled his council, but he also had to defer to it. In some ways, African kingdoms were ahead of those in Europe in devising checks and balances to limit the power of the king. Al-Magili was building on earlier traditions of African political administration when he made rules for the exercise of royal power.
Then later he wrote a constitution. And it was in this constitution that he provided for the establishment of a public complaints commission, Wilayat al-Mudhalim, in Arabic, which literally means public complaints commission, the institution of ombudsman. So you see, about 500 years ago, or even more, we had this institution of ombudsman in Hausa land.
But the king remained at the center of all things, especially at the center of spiritual power. For the celebration of a major religious festival, the king still leads the prayers of his people. Yet men don't live by prayer alone. The coming of Islam also helped to improve business dealings with Muslim merchants and traders right across northern and western Africa. Kano and its neighboring city-states lived within a wide regional community of productive interchange of manufactures, people, and ideas. They were fortunate in being placed in a land that lay between the frontiers of large empires. On the east, the Kanuri Empire of Kanem and of Bornu, and on the west, the ancient Mandinka Empire of Mali and the Sonrai Empire of the Middle Niger. The expanding production and trade of all these famous countries of the old Sudan enclosed the Hausa within a far-ranging network of caravan trails and transport. Camels provided the essential haulage system for a flourishing import-export business. Kano prospered as a commercial center. In the market, a leather worker hand stitches part of a camel saddle, one of many highly prized products which established Kano's reputation for skilled craftsmanship and manufacture. Kano leatherwork became so famous that it was traded across the Sahara as far as Morocco. From there it was sold again to Europe, even to buyers in England, where it became known as Morocco leather. Saddle blankets of quilted cotton, still made in Kano, have always been a valued item of trade and manufacture. Another textile, unique to the Kano area, was once so much in demand that it was traded the length and breadth of the Western Sudan. The story of these tightly woven rolls of cloth demonstrates the complexity and sophistication of traditional Kano industry. First, the weavers turn out long strips of white cloth on the narrowest looms anywhere in the world, a technique which produces an extremely dense weave. In the village of Kura, just outside Kano city, the strips of cloth are then sold to local businessmen. At this stage, they look like long, narrow bandages. The cloth buyers then arrange for the strips to be sewn together into broad widths of material. These are then taken to the nearby village of Bunkare for the next stage of the process. Dyeing with indigo is another ancient craft, long carried out in the Kano region. Here again one sees how Africans have evolved their own techniques for specific needs. In this case, the need has been, and still is, to produce a fine, darkly dyed material for buyers far and wide, but especially for the Tuareg of the Sahara Desert, who long ago adopted it as their traditional dress. The process has to be repeated over and over. The longer the process, the deeper the dye. Simple though the technique may appear to be, this is only one of several stages of manufacture. Periodically sprayed with water and pounded for hours on end, the finished product acquires a sheen that's much admired. It's this highly polished blue cloth which is then traded out of Kano market to make turbans for local dignitaries and veils for the Tuareg, the blue men of the desert. The manufacture and sale of textiles has been a staple industry in the villages around Kano for many centuries. Strips from looms like this, when sewn together into broad widths, were sold as robes or blankets to every people and kingdom in Western Africa. Here then was a nicely balanced community of interests between countryside and city, between producers and consumers. Industry and commerce guaranteed the city's prosperity. Whole villages which once were part of the Kano kingdom are given over to the manufacture of pottery. Once the pots are dried, they're taken to a central kiln for firing. Here, literally hundreds of pots can be fired at the same time, a cooperative system for the mass production of cooking vessels. Governing and exploiting all this industry and trade were the king and his council. The king enjoyed great wealth and enormous prestige. He was always the center of attention, surrounded by courtiers and officials. He could never afford to relax, even when confronted by the grotesque mockery of his jester. But alone in the royal garden within the palace walls, he could be his own man. Sheltered from his subjects, the king could try his hand at manual labor. Women are rarely seen by visitors to the palace. These women, entertaining themselves in one of the courtyards, are the wives and relatives of palace officials. The wives and numerous concubines of the king himself are never allowed to venture from the inner palace. Moslem practice and royal prudence combine to keep them in seclusion. The present emir, like the kings of Kano before him, has many children. The political advantage of large numbers of children is that it provides a royal clan to shore up the king's power, sons to help in administration, daughters to strengthen alliances. And instead of having to accept the oldest boy as the royal heir, the kingmakers could select the ablest. All this huge establishment had to be supplied with the basic necessities. The palace has always had a number of communal kitchens. Today, food must be bought at the market, but in the past it was taken from farms around the city as a form of taxation. The city and the palace depended on the countryside. The Hausa people's staple crop has always been guinea corn, known here as dawa, which has been grown in Africa for several thousand years. The king and the city exploited the country people, and the whole edifice of royal pomp and pageantry rested ultimately on the shoulders of the Hausa farmers. As early as the 11th century, records tell of the unpopularity of royal taxation. Fortunately, the countryside around Kano was unusually fertile. The great Arab traveller Al-Wasan, who visited Kano early in the 16th century, was astonished at the agricultural wealth of the area. He wrote in his memoir, Here groweth an abundance of corn, of rice, and of cotton. By the 16th century, grain was grown for sale as well as for domestic use. Within the kingdom, donkey caravans provided the transport system and assured the city of its food supply. Cattle have been the other great agricultural resource on these broad plains. The king himself and other prosperous city dwellers often owned cattle, which were grazed for them by professional herdsmen. Village and city life became interdependent in Hausa civilization, two sides of the same coin. Yet the indispensable source of wealth in Hausa land was not the city, but always the village, whether for production of food or of cotton or other manufactures. Village people paid taxes in cash or in kind to the king of Kano because he was powerful, but essentially because they depended on him and his government to keep law and order in the land, and when foreign enemies appeared, to protect them with the royal army. Armies were raised, just as in feudal Europe, by requiring noblemen and village chiefs to call out their servants and retainers to fight for the king in time of war. The king had some trained soldiers in his bodyguard, but most of his troops were part-time infantry, none too keen on winning glory. Again, it was Al-Maghili who advised the king to maintain a small standing army.
Have beside you at all times a band of faithful and gallant men, sentries, bowmen, horse and foot. Times of alarm are not like times of safety.
In that period of African history, kings and armies behaved very much as they did in Europe at the same time. Hausa states intrigued, formed alliances, broke them, and betrayed one another in a long series of minor wars. Today, the Kano army may be a trifle rusty, but when the bullhorn calls for courage, they do their best to dramatize the old assault tactics. And then, of course, comes grand confusion, just as in all the best regulated warfare. Victory. Then everyone dances. But these small wars, it seems, killed few, and only occasionally destroyed the peace and confidence of every day. The Hausa people who built Kano and other Hausa city-states were the makers of a strongly conscious, vivid and independent civilization. They owed much to the culture of Islam and much to their skills in manufacture for the long-distance trade, but were always in the end sufficient to themselves. They formed one of the great historic communities of old Africa. So the King of Kano, when he rides forth to greet his people, even today remains the symbol of a long development stretching back into the ancient past, very much remembered by the Hausa themselves. 500 years ago, Al-Magili gave this advice to the king.
Ride the horses of resolution on the saddles of prudence. Kingdoms are held by the sword, not by hesitation. Can fear be thrust back except by causing fear?
The parade is a demonstration of royal power. In all this lies the varied and contrasting panoply of civilization that Africans have made for themselves. A history so strangely unknown to people in the outside world, almost as though it had never existed. Africa's history is unique to itself, but it's also part of humanity's common inheritance. It's a story that can still unfold, even in the festivals of today, a powerful mystery and splendor. Each of the ancient kingdoms of Africa developed its own customs and beliefs and laws, yet each of them served the same three great duties: to provide a focus of faith and loyalty, to protect the people from enemies abroad, and at home to preserve the peace. Their record of success or failure, justice or injustice, has been remarkably like the record of other kingdoms in the world. In that heritage, we have all shared. Gold here was always important, but nobody can eat gold. The Niger has always provided fish in abundant quantities. and that's a vital source of protein in a local diet based largely on cereals. With no means of refrigeration in this hot climate, immediate drying or smoking of the fish has been essential, if they're to be kept for any length of time. By custom, this work is done by women, who usually share the profit on a family basis. Smoke-dried fish is carried and sold to towns and villages far from the river itself. A day's journey from Jenne, downstream along this broad river highway, traders reach Mopti, nowadays the biggest market along this section of the Niger. I've come to this port on the great inland waterway of West Africa, the River Niger, more than a thon. But in accordance with tradition, the king still has the right to promote his subordinate chiefs to higher ranks. These chiefs, as on similar occasions in the past, come forward one by one to reaffirm their loyalty and offer royal praises.
Na boje sapi so ko nyina ben wo ye ntimadu atram okukuru sunu kukuru di oda mre mu osia me akosie yae osia dani o.
Ashanti power rested on farming prosperity and military strength, but its gold had long attained a far wider influence. By a fortunate blessing, the majestic Niger, called by its people the River of Singers, lay to the north. A learned Egyptian visitor of the 14th century described this great trading region as 4 months of travel long and 4 months wide. The Mali Empire was, in fact, among the biggest trading systems in the world, with its roots in the gold of Western Africa. From the markets of the Upper Niger to those of Hausaland and Bornu, a distance wider than Western Europe, the Niger still carries a daily traffic whose style and tones speak for an ancient stability and peace. Along the upper reaches of the Niger River to the west of Jenne were becoming exhausted. But to the great advantage of trading towns like Jenne, a new source of gold began to be developed. Rich quantities of gold now came from the country to the south, today part of the modern Republic of Ghana. This development brought power and wealth to the forest people, and in due course to those of the kingdom of Ashanti. Even today, King Apoku-Ware, traditional ruler of Ashanti, can still display the glittering opulence which so astonished the first Europeans who visited this kingdom, founded 3 centuries ago. The Ashanti use of gold is lavish and extraordinary, and it reflects the golden wealth of the grand empires of Western Africa in the Middle Ages. More than 900 years ago, a North African historian described the royal court and ceremonial of that distant time in the empire of ancient Ghana, almost as though he were describing King Opokuwari of today.
The king adorns himself like a woman, wearing necklaces and bracelets of gold. Behind him stand pages holding shields and swords decorated with gold, and on his right are the sons of the subordinate kings of his country, all wearing splendid garments, and their hair plaited with gold.
Today, most of the king's political power has gone. Long before the first ships from Europe reached the distant shores of tropical Africa, a powerful and peaceful network of trade already existed. It was a vast commercial system whose markets and links by land and sea stretched as far as India and China. Its African heart lay far from the coast, here in the great medieval empire of Mali. Today, Mali is among the poorest countries in the world, but 600 years ago it was a land of wealth and comfort. This is Jenne, still a flourishing market town, but once a commercial center of far-ranging importance. Jenne guaranteed the prosperity of a great regional system, attracting camel caravans which brought merchandise from all points of the compass. The reason is explained in a single word. This was an economy based on gold. And that gold is much in evidence even today. The fascinating story of the Caravans of Gold may be unknown or quite forgotten in the outside world, but here in Jenne it's a story that remains vividly alive. Even a little side street of this ancient city, once part of the great empire of Mali, can afford a glimpse of rich traditions from the past. The fine jewellery of his craft still reflects the brilliance of the golden trade of old West Africa. The smith usually works from quantities of gold dust, melted in a crucible, and then fashioned by skillful beating into shapes long hallowed by tradition. The design of these earrings may reflect the art of the individual craftsman, but it never strays too far from the recognized styles preferred by the different peoples of the region, Bambara, Mandinka, Soninke, and others. Each of these peoples has its own distinctive jewelry. The size, rather than the style, gives an indication of a person's standing. Here, gold has always been used as much for display as for a standard of wealth. By about AD 1250, the oldest goldfields